own personal experience of my the operation of my mind does not fit or is not adequately to the extent theories are incomplete, you are always going to have a problem. The idea is then not to use a computational paradigm, but to simply invent a better computation paradigm.
Or to do what the computation paradigm does well, which is to say, to the extent that we want to build engineering systems, to the extent that we want to extend computation from vision to memory and memory to emotion and emotion to attention and so on and so forth, there is a very solid research program to be built in each one of these things. Because the details of how attention is modeled by computation will be different from how memory is done and so on and so forth. And that's actually, in practice, what most people do. At some times, of course, it becomes important to ask those meta-level questions, because if the field itself is approaching a certain point where these questions become important. So consciousness is an example of what I think 20 years ago was only philosophers were beginning to ask it. But now it's becoming thriving at the intersection of science and philosophy. So I think there's always one corner of your mental space you should keep for these narrow questions. Very back, sorry.
Yeah.
No, behind you, sorry, he has been racing for a while.
Yeah, I wanted to know, we've been talking about mind, which I understand it as an abstract model of the brain. So when you say mind,
Why do you do that? I mean,
what else could be mind?
not about it.
Because when you assume a computational model, take mind to be model as a model of the brain, abstract model. This is the way we modeled mental model genetic biology. The way we do the XY chromosome sort of model. The same way mind is an abstract way of talking about the human brain.
I mean, are you stating that as a fact?
That's how it is used, the word mind is used.
That's actually not the history of that use, right?
How do we understand the use of the word mind?
Well, the standard answer. So the standard answer right now is the computational functions that convert inputs to outputs. So, for example, the mind is what converts sound streams to sentences or to images to 3D models. I mean, that is the dominant, actually, in the cognitive sciences. That's the most precisely defined idea of the mind. Now, that itself can be expanded in several ways. So, one way would be, it's just like Fisher, model of Mendelian genetics that eventually became grounded in molecular biology. You could say, oh, these computational functions which are abstract are actually eventually grounded in some neural processes. That's one direction to go. But that, right? But
okay, I take that. So basically, reformulate. So the black box or the white box we're talking about is a combination of humans. We have the input and output. So what is the relationship? How do we relate that box with the input and the output? It's not. Is it autonomous from the input and output, or it has? Correlated with the input and output. Is there a reciprocal interaction between them, or is it just a one-way traffic?
But all of those can be addressed without bringing the brain. What I'm saying is, so the most general language, perhaps, which both neuroscience uses, robotics uses, and the cognitive sciences use, is broadly speaking sort of a control systems perspective, right? Which is you have bottom-up processes, you have top-down processes, you have various feedback loops, but where those feedback loops are implemented in neural systems, in practice, most cognitive scientists don't ask that question. Until recently, we didn't have the technology to fruitfully answer those questions. But now with imaging technology and perhaps better physiology, we may be able to. But I don't think there's a standard answer. And it's also not clear which way it's going to go. So one possibility is computation will be grounded in biology. It may turn out exactly the opposite. The biology will be grounded in computation. So it may turn out that what ultimately all these chromosomes and everything are doing in cells is really computation. And so it's pushing computation and cognition into biology rather than the other way around. We don't actually know how it's going to turn out.
It also depends on how limitedly you want to define. Mind is brain can be a tautology instead of being an explanation. In the sense that, if you look at, if we take the computation model and say where the inputs for the processing are coming from, one can limit oneself. If one limits oneself to what is physically embodied in your brain, then it leaves out things like culture. There are lots of things are stored. Some of the behaviors are coming from that. They are not implicitly
but which is
traceably stored in your brain.
But which is what already you can see, that as soon as you open your investigation to social or cultural influences, you're immediately pointing to causal effects that lie outside the brain, right? And of course, that's actually at the cutting. So embodied cognition, for example, says the brain is not the only material entity that is relevant to cognition. So, of course, nobody has spelled out exactly how. The great advantage of the computational theory of mind combined with brain science was you could start saying this area of the brain is doing this kind of processing which leads to these kinds of outputs based on these kinds of inputs. Embodied cognition is very far away from that level of precise theorizing.
Just a relevant comment I want to make. There's something called this the Bradenberg vehicles. So these vehicles were proposed by this person called Bradenberg. So the structure of these vehicles is something like that. There is one sensor to start with. So the structure of vehicles revolves from simplest to complex. So the simplest vehicle would be with one sensor and one motor, and then the sensor might be sensitive to anything, be it temperature or say light, and dependent on the gradient of the intensity of the light or say any input, the vehicles behave as if they have mind. There seems to be some mechanism with which the vehicles or the robots are making some decisions to move around.
But you are actually bringing up something. I'm going to cut you off just because it's almost, it's past 1 o'clock. So I'll give you a brief. So if you haven't read Valentino Bradenberg's book, it's called Vehicles, you should. It's a beautiful book. It's actually a series of thought experiments disguised as engineering. Right? So in that sense, it's an interesting project. But what it tells you is that we are very bad at coming up with, so at one level we are experts in having minds, but another level we are very, very bad at figuring out when something in front of us really has a mind or not. Children will be fooled by dolls, adults are fooled by robots, but it's not clear if your operational criterion is, I can't distinguish between what's a robot and what is genuinely human, then they both have the same quality. To me, that's a suspect assumption in the first place. Just as if I cannot distinguish between, a planet. If somehow somebody wires me into a matrix and I can't distinguish between the universe that is exposed to me in the matrix from the physical universe, nobody would legitimately say these two therefore must be the same. One hits you on the head and kills you, and the other doesn't. Right? There is, of course, a very.
My comment also related to this question.
No, but I'm just saying that this issue of definitions, this issue of where do you draw the distinction between artificial and real, we have to be careful about asking these questions and do it systematically rather than just assume that there is some.